Good morning and welcome to another online Sunday school class with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. As always, we like to begin by reminding you that we here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church believe that Jesus is the Christ, that He is the Son of the living God who lived a perfect life and died a sacrificial death for your sins and for mine, and that He rose from the grave 3 days later to give us new life in Him. If you'd like more information about what it means to make Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior, we would invite you to follow the link in the description. This will take you to a full gospel presentation. It'll also show you how to respond to the gospel and how to connect with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we would invite you to join us for worship right here on Sunday mornings at 11 o'clock. We are both in person and online through Facebook Live. If you do not live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we still want to connect with you because we want to help you find a Bible-believing church where you do live. We are continuing on in our study of the book of Acts, and we are in session 12, which is titled Respond. And we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 26, verses 19 through 29. So again, this is the 12th session in our study titled Respond, looking at Acts chapter 26, verses 19 through 29. As we dive into our study this morning, I wanted to kind of begin by asking the question, what social media platforms do you use? If you're watching this right now, you're either watching this probably on Facebook or YouTube, which would both qualify as kind of social media sites, places where people post pictures or make videos. Excuse me, do various different things. You might use one of the other ones out there like Instagram or X, or some people use things like Pinterest or My Neighborhood or things like that. And when you think about those, has there ever been a time when you were posted something on there where you made a comment, where you left a review, who knows what it is, and you got negative feedback because of that? That because of something you said or something you reacted to or something that maybe you posted or even just gave a review to, that you got some criticism, you got kind of some negative feedback because of that online, and hopefully you have and all that. But I want to ask this question as it relates to that maybe occurrence that happened, and that is this: what is the best way to respond to criticism online when you have made a recommendation or posted your opinion on some way, shape, or form? What is the best way that you think is to respond to that criticism? And so here's what we want to do. We're going to ask questions throughout our study today, and we want you to respond to those questions. We want to actually get some interaction from you. And so as we ask questions today, we want to encourage you to pause the video and then actually interact with us. So if you're watching this by yourself, get a pen, paper, write some things down, really write down your thoughts to the questions that we asked. You can kind of give yourself a little notebook for maybe future lessons that you will watch. If you're watching this with your spouse, with family, I would encourage you to really have those conversations. Hit pause, have those conversations, and in both cases, whenever you're ready, just hit play again. So again, the question is this: in light of maybe negative responses, negative criticism you have gotten from online, from social media, from online platforms, what is the best way to respond to criticism online? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, and then whenever you're ready, we'll keep going in our study. All right, so hopefully you had some answers on what you would do to respond to online criticism. I will be honest, for me, the vast majority of the time, my response is no response. Is if someone says something negative, now if they're saying something personal or attacking me or something that I feel is inappropriate to maybe whatever it was, I'll just delete it. And if they keep going, then I'll not only delete it, but I'll block them. But for the most part, my response is no response, because my personal opinion is I have never seen anyone's opinion changed in a good, helpful way online, and that often people will take whatever you write and twist it and try to change what you said in order to make it say something that you didn't say. And so my response has often been to just let criticism go, not worry about it, and not react to it in any way, shape, or form. The book has this to say. It says, no one likes being criticized or judged unfairly, yet it's something we all face at one time or another. As a preacher and as a missionary, Paul faced a lot of criticism and false accusations. But instead of being defensive, he found ways to use those opportunities to share the gospel and to call people, even people who might be close to his message, to embrace Jesus. One of the things the book said that I found pretty entertaining was it said, for an innocent man, Paul found himself on trial a lot. And I thought that was a clever way of saying that, and definitely a true way of saying that. So as we drop into our passage today, we're going to be in Acts chapter 26, starting in verse 19. And as we drop into that passage today, what we're going to find is once again, Paul is on trial. And this time he's on trial. He's been in Jerusalem, and he is kind of scooped up in the temple and brought before the leadership that's there. And he's initially brought before the governor of the area, who's a guy by the name of Festus. Now, Festus is a Roman guy. He really is not that familiar with Jewish tradition. He really doesn't know what any of this has to do with him or with his rule. And so he, for the most part, just kind of put Paul aside. Paul appealed to Caesar, which meant he got a trip to Rome out of it to make his case before Caesar in kind of the highest court. And because of that, Festus just really isn't that interested in dealing with Paul. There's going to be Festus. I think that's the main person we're going to be talking about today. Let me make sure I've got that correct, because there's a couple of names that all sound very familiar. Yes, it is Festus. But what we're going to find today is Festus had another person that came to visit that was a little bit more knowledgeable. And this guy was King Agrippa. And what his real name was King Herod Agrippa II. And so he is the great-grandfather of the King Herod from the Christmas story. He is the son of Herod Agrippa that we meet earlier in the book of Acts, and it was the one that killed James. And this guy is actually very familiar with the Jews and with Jewish customs, would consider himself a God-fearer or even a Jew himself, and had a lot more understanding. And so because of that, Festus said, hey, I've got this guy named Paul that I'm trying to figure out what exactly he's done. And really, more than anything, he knows that he's got to send him to Caesar, but he kind of has to do that in a way that says, I got to send him there with some sort of reason why I'm sending him. Because if I just send him because I wanted to make the Jews happy, and the Jewish leadership that I'm in control of happy, that's not going to look well for me politically and all that. So he goes, so why don't you come hear what he has to say, and you help me understand, communicate what this man is being accused of and why he is under trial and all those type of things. And that's really where our scene is set, is we have come to a place where King Agrippa, who has background, who knows about Judaism and kind of has some faith therein, is now hearing Paul and give a defense or give a testimony for why he's in trouble. And what it ultimately becomes is an opportunity for Paul to share the gospel with King Agrippa. And that's where we're picking up today. We're going to be in Acts chapter 26, starting in verse 29. I'm going to read through to verse 23 to get us started. And I want you to listen for where Paul got the authority for his message, kind of how this all began. So picking up in verse 19, we read these words. So then, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. Instead, I preached to those in Damascus first, and to those in Jerusalem and all the region of Judea, and to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God and do works worthy of repentance. For this reason, the Jews seized me in the temple and were trying to kill me. To this very day, I have had help from God. I stand and testify to both small and great, saying nothing other than the prophets and Moses that prophets and Moses said took place, that the Messiah must suffer, and that the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light to our people and to the Gentiles. So let's think about this for just a second, and let's think about the authority from which Paul is speaking. He recognizes, and if we actually read back a few verses, that Paul had been commissioned and Paul had been given this task from Jesus himself, that this begins with him talking about who he was before and about the what occurred on the Roman road. And so he's saying, like, after all this took place, after the heavenly vision, this was my task. This is what I was called to do. And so that's exactly what he does. And he begins to go, and it says he went to Damascus, and then he was in Jerusalem, and then he went to the ends of the earth to do this work and to do what God has called him to do. Gives him that quick synopsis of kind of his ministry and how far it was, and that authority really ultimately and truly came from God, and that and all of this is first person. This is all him giving his own testimony. This is what God has done in my life. And I think what's really important to notice here is he says in the midst of all of this, he says, to this very day, I have had help from God and stand and testify to both great and small, saying nothing other than what the prophets and Moses said would take place. He's not only appealing to what the scriptures say, but he's saying, listen, God has delivered me. God has worked in my life. I have seen how he has even carried me all the way to here, and he's giving God all of the credit. But he's saying the authority on which I stand, the authority that I'm speaking from, is the authority that I've received from God. And you can see that by how God has taken care of me and he has protected me, and how even as I stand before you now, I am okay. This leads the book to ask this question: what role should a believer's personal experience play when sharing the gospel? Why don't you take a couple minutes, pause the video, answer that question either on paper or in discussion, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, so the question was, what role should our personal experience play in sharing the gospel? And I would argue it should play a huge role. In fact, even if you're sharing the gospel using some sort of strategy that you've learned, where maybe it's the best news, maybe it's the three circles, maybe it's the Roman road, whatever it might be, there still has to be a personal element to it, because you are sharing with someone else what Christ has done for you and what that impact had on you. And so when we're sharing the gospel, we're constantly bringing in our life and our sin and what Jesus did for us that he can do for them too. And not only is your personal testimony powerful when it comes to sharing your faith and having those kind of gospel conversations, but also just making the gospel presentation one that you've preached to yourself, one that resonates with how it has affected you, and even showing them through that. Like, this is what the gospel means for me. That is a huge thing. When Paul stands before them and he says, I used to persecute the church, I used to abuse Christians, I wanted to see killed. I wanted to see them annihilated. I did everything I could to annihilate this thing called the way, these Christians, these little Christs. I did everything I could to oppose them, but now I am an outspoken advocate for them because of what Jesus has done for me. That's huge. That's huge for Paul, and that's huge for you too. Even if you say, well, I grew up in a Christian home and I kind of became aware of my sin at a young age, but even just the fact that you came to saving faith and how you've continued to walk with the Lord all these years for whatever reason, that's a powerful thing. That's something that says, I am convinced that Jesus rose from the grave. And that's something that you should communicate. And that's something I think we can learn from this passage today. One thing I want you to notice from the passage is this thing that Paul says in the midst of all of that he's doing. He says that I have said this to both great and small. He is letting them know that he has done all of this. Let me see if I can find that place. He says, to this very day I have help from God, and I stand and testify to both small and great. And I love this because when you think about where he is, that's really what makes it significant. He says, listen, I am giving you the same message I've given everybody. So whether it was the least of these, whether it was by the Jewish standards, some Gentile, or someone unimportant, the poor, a slave, whatever it might be, I've preached the same gospel to all of these people. And whether it was a slave or you, King Agrippa, someone who has been marked and named a king by Caesar himself, that he goes, whether great or small, I have preached the same gospel, that the message hasn't changed, that this is what it is, and this is what it's all about. And so he's telling them that. And really a big part of that is him kind of saying, like, hey, what I'm telling you now is what I was preaching at the temple and what I did on my journeys and what I've done everywhere, that I have preached the same gospel, whether you are a slave or a king. And I want you to know that as you're hearing this today. Let's see what happens next. We're going to read verses 24 through 26. And I want you to listen for Festus's accusation and Paul's response. We're going to see a little crowd interaction here after Paul has said this. Picking up in verse 24, we're going to read just 24 through 26. He says this, and as he was saying these things in his defense, Festus exclaimed in a loud voice, "You're out of your mind, Paul. Too much study is driving you mad." But Paul replied, I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus. On the contrary, I'm speaking words of truth and good judgment. For the king knows about these matters, and I can speak boldly to him. For I am convinced that none of these things have escaped his notice, since he was not, because it was not done in a corner. And so, man, what a powerful statement here. So we get that initial accusation from Festus. And if we think about what he says here, he says, first off, he says, you're crazy. You are out of your mind. And then he doesn't just say, like, you've just lost it, you snapped, that it's because of no other reason, chemical imbalance, whatever. He says, you have lost your mind. You have spent too much time in the books. And I think what he's really saying here is, you spent too much time studying the scriptures. You spent too much time studying the rabbinical things and all the things that a Pharisee would study. And his study of scripture and his study of all that stuff had just had a disconnect from the world. And so then he kind of, and we might even kind of try to explain it like he had this disconnect. He took everything he read, he lumped it on this person named Jesus, and then that's what's happening. But his response is that no, that's not what's happening. I really like the book points out that Paul was not unfamiliar with people interrupting his story, and there wasn't he didn't get frazzled, he didn't get off his game because he'd gotten shouted out, or even shouted out by this ruler, this governor. But he stayed right on message and right on point, that this was something he had experienced. And really look at how Paul responds. He gets accused for being out of his mind, and he says, I'm not out of my mind. These are words of truth, that these are good judgment. And then he looks at King Agrippa and he goes, and you know what I'm saying is true. You know the scriptures. You're familiar with the Old Testament. You know what the prophets said. You know these things. You've been taught these things. You know that nothing I'm saying has departed from a good understanding of the scriptures, or a good understanding of Judaism. And he's saying, you know these things. You've seen what has happened. And you know what the truth is. And he makes this really interesting statement, where he makes this statement about it not being done in a corner. And we're not entirely sure what this saying meant, at least at this place in time. But for us today, we would understand this as, this was not done in secret. This was not done in just one little tiny area. And in either way he might have been saying it, the idea here is that the impact of Christianity on even their world by this point was noticeable. That the people who followed the way, the people who were following Jesus, that they were outspoken, that they proclaimed what they were doing and they didn't hide it, that it was done in the public square, in the public circles, and that it wasn't just some little part of Jerusalem that had these people that believed a weird thing. That Christianity had it spread from Jerusalem throughout Judea to Caesarea to Antioch to all over the Roman Empire. There was these people making the good news of the gospel known, and that it wasn't in the corner of the town, nor was it done in secret in some dark corner that no one noticed, but it was a very public, expanding thing. And he's saying, this isn't crazy. There is a reason why this is growing. All of this is real. The book asks this question. It says, how can we respond when we are mocked or face opposition from our faith? If you had the person, when you're telling someone about Jesus, or you're telling this person about Jesus, responded to you and said, you are out of your mind, how would you respond? How can we respond even when we're mocked or face opposition for our faith? Take a couple minutes, discuss that, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, so how would you respond to that? The book actually gives us a really fun example about opposition and facing opposition. And it tells the story about, there's this physician quite some time ago by the name of Semmelweis, and he was a doctor, and he began to notice that specifically when they were delivering babies where he lived, that if the people who were involved in the whole process, if they washed their hands before being a part of that process, and before working with the mothers and all that stuff, that the survival rate for both mother and baby seemed to increase. And he began to make the analogy, or make the kind of communicate the understanding that washing your hands before doing medical things seemed to be a benefit to the patient, to the people that you were caring for. Because, and this was at a time in medicine where we didn't understand about germs and bacteria and that type of stuff. And so he was mocked, and they told him he was crazy and he was out of his mind. And it wasn't until after he died that they realized that not only what his observations were true, but why they were true. And so we can kind of look at that example and explain it to you as like, listen, this may look crazy, but it's because you don't fully understand what is happening in the world around you, what is happening in the spiritual realm. And so one of the things we can do is say, hey, I understand that you think this looks crazy. I understand that this is something very different from you, and this may be something you've never heard before, and therefore you're kind of still figuring it out and trying to understand it. But just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it's not true. Just because it may be something new to you doesn't mean that it's something crazy. And so there's a way that we can kind of communicate that with grace, but also holding fast to what we believe and why we believe it. Let's look at the last passage in our study today, and this is Acts chapter 26. We're going to pick up in verse 27 and read through to verse 29. And as we do so, I want you to listen for Paul's ultimate desire for his listeners. So this is how he closes all of that out. He tells them, that this was not done in the corner. And then look what he says in verse 27. King Agrippa. So he's had kind of the statement by Festus. He's saying, no, this is true. And King Agrippa knows what it says. And he says this, King Agrippa, he addresses him directly. Do you believe the prophets? I know you believe. And King Agrippa said to Paul, are you going to persuade me to become a Christian so easily? And Paul responded, I wish before God that whether easily or with difficulty, not only you, but all who listen to me today might become as I am, except for these chains. So when we think about what Paul's ultimate desire for his listeners was that they came to saving faith. And this is an amazing thing when you think about this. These are the people that are accusing him. These are the people that can condemn him. These are the people whose his life is in their hands, and he is literally standing in opposition to. And his ultimate goal, his ultimate desire is, I want to see these people come to saving faith. I want to see these people come to Christ. I know they may not think that now. I know they may be in opposition to me now. I know that it may not happen today, but God, my desire, whether it is easy or with great difficulty, that these people would come to saving faith, that they would be as I am, that they would be saved from their sins. And the only thing he says is, but I would hope that they are saved from their sins, but they don't get arrested for it, and they are not in the term in chains means like under house arrest or under arrest for what they believe. This leads the book to ask this question. It says, why did Paul ask King Agrippa if he believed in the prophets? Notice again in our passage, he says, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you believe. Why do you think he's asking him that specific question? Take a couple minutes, answer that question, and then we're going to start to wrap up our study. All right, so why do you think that is? I think there's really an affirmation of the Bible here. I think this is actually an important evangelism tool for us as well. When we're sharing our faith with people, we want to continue to be asking, do you understand what I'm saying? Do you believe this? All that type of stuff. Even when we're getting into those conversations and we may be moving into the baptism realm or church membership or something like that, we want to come back and say, do you believe that Jesus is the Christ? Do you believe that the scriptures are true? Paul knew that the prophets pointed to Jesus. And Paul knew that he had done an adequate job of showing Agrippa that the prophets pointed to Jesus. And so by asking him, do you believe the prophets? If he says yes, and that's really the question he's going for, do you say yes? In fact, we see it. He says, do you believe the prophets? I know you believe. He wants that affirmation because he can say, if you believe that what the prophets say are true, then you have to believe that Jesus is the Christ, because the Bible is one consistent story of how God so loved the world that he sent his one and only Son, that whosoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. And I have to point this out. I have to point out Agrippa's response. He asked him that question. Agrippa knows, he's not dumb. He knows that he's leaving breadcrumbs to get Agrippa to a place where he has to say, well, yeah, I do believe that the prophets say is. And he says, then you'll have to believe in Jesus. And so he says this, are you going to persuade me to become a Christian so easily? And what he's really saying here is, do you think I'm going to make it that easy for you? I don't think he's necessarily saying like, oh my God, oh my goodness, you're making this so easy for me to believe in Jesus. But he's saying, do you really think I'm going to make it that easy for you? Do you really think you're going to convert me to Christianity so easily? And Paul says, my hope is, whether it's easy or under great difficulty, that you would become a Christian. And whether it's this conversation right here, right now, or if it's 10 years from now, from constant exposure to the gospel and all that, I want to see you come to saving faith. The book says it this way. It says, he longed for all of his listeners to know Jesus the way he knew Jesus. And that was his hope and his prayer. This leads the book to ask this question. It says, how can we prepare ourselves to initiate gospel conversations? And I want to go ahead and pause the video one more time before we close out completely and answer this question. How can we prepare ourselves to initiate gospel conversations? Take a couple minutes, discuss that, and then we will close out our study. All right, so how can we prepare to initiate gospel conversations? And my answer is simply this: practice, practice, practice. I know there are some wonderful godly brothers in our church that are going to say prayer, and they are absolutely right. We need to be praying for it, but we need to be practicing it. We need to be practicing how we go from talking about common things to talking about spiritual things. We need to practice how we initiate those conversations. We need to practice what we're going to say, especially if we already have a good idea of who we need to share the gospel with. But the answer is practice, practice, practice. And that's exactly how I want to close out our time today. The book challenges us to do this. It challenges us to think about how we can make connections to share our faith with other people, and that we should prepare ourselves so that we know what we're going to say when the time arises. And so here's what I want you to do to close out your time together. I want you to take some time, and I want you to really think about, and maybe even have in mind that person that God's laid on your heart to share the gospel with. And I want you to write out, I want you to really think about what you would say to someone if you were able to get in that gospel conversation. What would be your bridge? What would be that thing that you might start talking about to get into a gospel conversation? Maybe it's something to do with work. Maybe it's something to do with family. Maybe it has something to do with your kids. What are you going to say to bridge it into a gospel conversation? And what are you going to say for that gospel conversation? Close out your time writing that down, making that plan. And then we want to encourage you to pray over that plan and do it. By all means, act out that plan, execute that plan this week with that person that God's laid on your heart. And then join us for worship right here at 11 o'clock. We are both in person. We are also online through Facebook Live. Thank you for joining us for our time together today. God bless.